The sound of Elsie's muffled sobs greeted me as I stepped into Derek and Marlene's house to celebrate my granddaughter's 12th birthday. My heart sank. Those weren't the joyful cries of a happy child. I followed the noise down the hallway to a room with a steel door, no decorations adorning its cold surface. "Derek? Marlene?" I called out, knocking firmly. No response. I pressed my ear against the unforgiving metal. Elsie's whimpers grew louder, intermingled with the familiar scratching of pencil against paper. Using the spare key Derek had given me, I unlocked the door. The sight before me ignited a fire of rage within. My sweet Elsie sat hunched over a piano keyboard, red-eyed and frazzled. The room was dimly lit and lined wall-to-wall with music sheets, like a prison cell designed to strip her of creativity and joy. "Elsie!" I gasped, darting to her side. She flinched, her listless gaze slowly meeting mine. "Honey, what's going on? Are you okay?" Before she could respond, the door burst open. Marlene stood fuming, her face contorted into a scowl that sent shivers down my spine. "What are you doing in here?" she growled, snatching Elsie by the arm and wrenching her away from me. "I told you not to disturb her practice," Elsie whimpered, trembling in Marlene's vice-like grip. "But Grandma!" "Silence!" Marlene's shrill voice silenced her pleading cry. "You know the rules. No distractions until you've perfected this piece." "Marlene, that's enough!" I stepped forward, shielding Elsie with my body. "What kind of hellish prison is this? She's just a child, for God's sake." Marlene's glare could have melted steel. "Stay out of this, Mother. You're too soft on her. Elsie has a gift, and I'll do whatever it takes to nurture it." By locking her away like a caged animal? Look at her, Marlene. She's absolutely miserable. Tough love is necessary to achieve greatness, something you never understood with Derek. She spat the words like venom. "I won't let Elsie squander her talents like her father did. Not on my watch." My blood boiled, but I refused to engage her twisted rationalization. Keeping my tone measured, I turned to my trembling granddaughter. "Elsie, sweetheart, go wait in the living room. I need to have a talk with your mother." Elsie hesitated, her eyes pleading for an escape hatch. But Marlene's iron glare subdued her momentary courage. With a defeated sigh, she slumped out of that wretched room, not even bothering to grab her belongings. As the door clicked shut, I wheeled on Marlene, aiming my fiercest look straight into her delusional eyes. "How dare you treat her this way? Have you lost your mind?" Marlene scoffed, folding her arms defiantly. "I'm giving her the training, the discipline that she needs to become a world-class pianist, something you could never comprehend." "And at what cost?" I demanded, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Her childhood? Her happiness? You're stealing her spirit away, piece by piece." "Don't be so dramatic." She rolled her eyes. "I'm doing what's best for her future success. Unlike you, I'm not going to let my child's potential go to waste." Her words stung, dredging up past failures I thought I'd buried long ago. But this wasn't about me or my shortcomings. It was about protecting Elsie. I steeled my resolve, meeting Marlene's contemptuous glare with unwavering determination. "If you think for 1 second that I'll stand by while you crush that poor girl's soul, you're gravely mistaken. This ends now." The battle lines were drawn. As Marlene and I stared each other down in that dimly lit chamber of horrors, I knew there would be no turning back. For Elsie's sake, I had to fight and win. After my confrontation with Marlene, I stormed out of that cursed house, my mind racing. How could she treat Elsie that way? My own granddaughter, sobbing and imprisoned like a common criminal? The thought made me ill. In the days that followed, I did some digging into Marlene's past. What I uncovered explained a lot about her twisted motivations. Marlene came from an affluent family with a reputation for musical excellence to uphold. Her own mother, a celebrated concert pianist, had groomed her relentlessly as a prodigy from a young age. The pressure crushed Marlene's passion, but she dutifully followed the path laid out for her, until she faltered during a career-defining recital at Juilliard. That failure shattered her psyche, and her family promptly disowned her in disgrace. The revelation crushed her dreams and her spirit. She spent years drifting aimlessly until meeting my son Derek. Somehow, the strength and stability Derek provided helped Marlene regain her sense of purpose. But the wounds of her childhood never healed. Her obsession with molding Elsie into the musical icon she could never become only grew more ravenous, more unhinged. I knew then that if I didn't act fast, Marlene would rob Elsie of her very identity. A few days later, I invited myself over again, this time with the pretense of a family chat. As expected, Marlene treated me with icy disdain, but I refused to back down. "You can't treat Elsie like a circus animal forever," I scolded her in the living room. "She's a growing girl who needs freedom, friends, sunshine." Marlene rolled her eyes. "Don't start with your sentimental crap again. All that matters is hardening Elsie's focus, eliminating distractions. That's the only way she'll reach her full potential." "By destroying her spirit?" I cried incredulously. On cue, Elsie shuffled in looking ragged and exhausted. "There you are, lazy bones," Marlene snapped. "Get over here and show Grandma how far we've come." The haunted look in my granddaughter's eyes as she took her place at the piano keys will forever be seared into my brain. Slowly, mechanically, she began playing an intricate Mozart piece with cold, clinical precision. Not an ounce of passion or joy flowed from those nimble fingers. When she finished, Marlene turned to me with a triumphant smirk. "You see? Perfection takes sacrifice. That's something your pathetic son could never grasp." Before I could object, Elsie suddenly collapsed into a fit of shuddering sobs. In a flash, I was at her side, cradling the poor girl as she cried into my chest. "Please." "No more," she whimpered between ragged breaths. I can't do this anymore." My blood boiled over as I glared at the vile woman towering over us. "Are you happy now, you wretched hag? Look at what you've done to her." Marlene's face flushed a deep crimson, her lips curling into a sneer of pure contempt. "How dare you let sentiment cloud your judgment? I'll not have my daughter grow up to be a quitter like the rest of your loser family." I saw red. Before I could stop myself, I stood and charged at Marlene, my hands coiled into trembling fists. "You evil, miserable Hey!" A booming voice froze me mid-lunge. Derek barreled into the room, grabbing me by the shoulders. "What in the hell is going on here?" As my son stared at me in shock and confusion, I knew I had to make him see the truth. If I didn't, Marlene's torment of Elsie would never end. I couldn't fail now, not when my granddaughter's future was at stake. Steeling my nerves, I turned to Derek and uttered the words I'd been dreading. "Your wife is abusing your daughter." Derek stood frozen, his mouth agape as my accusation hung in the air like a suffocating fog. Marlene wasted no time trying to regain control of the situation. "Don't listen to her ramblings, dear," she purred, slithering up to Derek with serpentine charm. "You know how emotional your mother can get. She's just jealous of Elsie's talents." "Jealous?" I sputtered, my rage bubbling over. "You twisted, delusional snake! I'm trying to protect my granddaughter from your psychotic abuse." Derek's brow furrowed in confusion as he looked from me to Marlene and back again. "Abuse? What are you talking about, Mom?" "Open your eyes, son," I pleaded, gesturing to the disheveled, cowering form of Elsie still crumpled on the floor. "Look at what your wife's training has done to that sweet child." A glimmer of clarity crept across Derek's face as he absorbed the heart-wrenching scene before him. But Marlene swiftly snuffed it out with a theatrical display of motherly affection. Sweeping over to Elsie, she scooped the quivering girl into a tight embrace. There, Pumpkin, don't listen to Grandma's scary stories. Mommy just wants what's best for her little star." Derek's jaw clenched as he warred with the conflicting realities vying for his trust. In that moment, I realized the true insidiousness of Marlene's manipulations. I had to break through at all costs. "That's enough of your lies," I bellowed, startling them both. Reaching into my pocket, I revealed the sleek phone I had purposely left recording audio during our confrontation. "You hear that, Derek? I have proof of the vile way your witch of a wife treats your daughter." My voice dripped with a mixture of fury and triumph as realization crept across Marlene's twisted features. You had no right," she seethed through gritted teeth. "Every right," I shot back with righteous fury. "As her grandmother, I'll do whatever it takes to protect Elsie from your madness." Derek stood shell-shocked as Marlene and I faced off, tremors of rage rolling off us both in palpable waves. Finally, my son found his voice. "Mother," he said in a tone that brokered no argument, "show me what you have on that recording. Now." My heart soared with vindication as I eagerly played back the device. Marlene's harrowing threats and insults filled the room in lurid detail as poor Elsie wept and pleaded for mercy. Derek's face drained of color as the truth burrowed into his consciousness. When the clips ended, a heavy silence blanketed us all. Nobody dared break it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Derek moved toward Marlene with grim determination. "Get out," he said in a low, dangerous rumble. Marlene blinked, her mouth forming a shocked "Oh." "What?" "You heard me," Derek growled through gritted teeth. "I want you out of this house. Tonight. I'll make arrangements for Elsie and send for your things later." But Derek," Marlene sputtered, her mask of regal confidence melting away as panic set in. "You can't be serious. It's all a misunderstanding." Derek's face twisted into an expression of pure disgust and loathing. "Save it. I'm done being blinded by your manipulations. What kind of mother terrorizes their own child like that?" His words lanced deep, a killing blow to Marlene's delusional charade. She opened her mouth as if to protest further, but seemed to think better of it. With a final, hateful glare in my direction, she stormed out of the room. Elsie watched her mother's retreat with a strange, hollow look, as if awakening from a long, tumultuous dream. Derek pulled her close, cradling his daughter's fragile form while I looked on with bittersweet relief. The worst was over, or so I thought at the time. But the battle to secure Elsie's freedom had only just begun. In the days following Marlene's explosive exit, an uneasy calm settled over Derek's household. Elsie roamed the home in a daze, as if emerging from a years-long trance. Simple pleasures like playing outside or watching cartoons seemed novel concepts to her. Derek tried valiantly to make up for lost time, but his demanding job often pulled him away, leaving me to pick up the pieces and guide my wounded granddaughter back to normalcy. It wasn't easy. Years of Marlene's toxic manipulations had taken their toll, but I was determined to help Elsie rediscover the joy and freedom she deserved. Our neighbor Simon Hayes proved an unexpected ally in that mission. A kindly divorced man who lived 2 doors down, Simon had quietly observed the troubling patterns at Derek's home for years. I had my suspicions something wasn't right over there, he told me one morning as we sipped coffee on his patio. But every time I tried getting close to Elsie, that psycho wife of Derek's would chase me off like a mangy dog. I shuddered, remembering Marlene's fierce territorial instincts when it came to protecting Elsie from outside influences. Well, she's out of the picture now. For good, I hope. Simon's expression turned grave. You know it won't be that easy, right? Women like that don't just slink away quietly. His ominous words sent a chill down my spine. Before I could respond, Elsie bounded over, her face alight for the first time in ages. "Grandma, Mr. Simon, can I go explore the creek today?" She bounced on her toes with pent-up energy, reminding me so vividly of her joy-filled younger self. "Of course, sweetie," I beamed, pulling her into a bear hug. "Just be back before dinner, okay?" She grinned and scampered off, grabbing a sketch pad and colored pencils on her way out. A familiar pang tugged at my heart as I watched her go. How many other childhood memories had that evil woman stolen from my grandbaby? "You got lucky, you know." Simon's gruff voice pulled me from my brooding. Having proof of what that psycho was doing, I nodded soberly. "Believe me, I know, which is why I'll stay vigilant until we've secured Elsie's future for good." The burly man frowned, seeming to wrestle with something on his mind. Finally, he spoke up in a low, conspiratorial tone. "There's more. Things I've documented over the years. Videos, audio recordings, stuff that could really nail that witch to the wall in court if need be." I gaped at him in astonishment. "Videos? Of Marlene? How?" Simon's expression turned grim. "Let's just say I invested in some high-tech security cameras a while back, the kind that can see and hear for blocks." He let that ominous fact linger for a beat before continuing. "Look, I got the footage backed up somewhere safe. Could help make sure that snake never slithers near Elsie again." My head spun as I processed his bombshell admission. Part of me felt guilty about the prospect of weaponizing a neighbor's surveillance data against Marlene. But after the hell she'd put my family through, I quickly shoved those qualms aside. "Thank you, Simon," I replied with grave sincerity. "I vow to use any ammunition at my disposal to protect Elsie going forward." The man grunted and gave a resolute nod. "You just say the word and I'll—" "Elsie!" Derek's panicked bellow cut our hushed conference short. He came tearing around the hedges toward us, eyes wild and chest heaving. "Marlene, she showed up out of nowhere," he sputtered, struggling to catch his breath. grabbed Elsie and is trying to take her somewhere. What? I shot to my feet, blood draining from my face. Oh God, no. Simon was already in motion, bolting for his back door. Stay here. I'll get the van. As Derek collapsed in a heap on the patio, I felt the winds of battle whipping up once again. Marlene was far from finished, and so was my fight to save Elsie's future. By the time Simon screeched his van into Derek's driveway, I had already sprung into frantic motion. I burst through the front door, Derek hot on my heels, and began a desperate search for any signs of my missing granddaughter. Elsie? I called out in a strained, quavering voice. Elsie, where are you? No response except the faint rustle of leaves fluttering outside an open window. Fear gripped me in icy talons as visions of Marlene's twisted revenge played out in lurid detail in my mind's eye. She came out of nowhere. Derek kept repeating in a daze, his face drained of color. Just appeared like a ghost and grabbed Elsie before I could react. Simon brushed past us both, his jaw set in grim determination. I'm calling the cops. She couldn't have gotten far with a kid in tow. But I knew better than to underestimate the lengths Marlene would go to hold on to her warped ambitions. My heart thundered to a staccato beat of pure rage and dread as I tore through the house, hunting any clue to where that psychotic woman had fled with my Elsie. Finally, a tiny voice reached my ears from the direction of the living room. A voice so pitiful and broken that it froze the blood in my veins. Grandma. I wheeled around, following the sound to a closet door left ajar. Summoning every ounce of my courage, I pulled it open to find a horrific sight. Elsie, crumpled in a trembling heap, one hand bound with rope to the metal rack above, her eyes brimmed with a haunted mixture of terror and pleading as her lips formed the words again. Grandma, help! Elsie! I cried out, quickly untying the knot and scooping her frail body into my arms. Oh, honey, what did that monster do to you? Mother? She whimpered, clinging to me with desperation. She said couldn't leave until I was perfect. My heart sank in revulsion as fitful glimpses of what Marlene had put this poor child through flashed across my mind's eye. Clutching Elsie tighter, I spun to see Derek and Simon staring at us with twin masks of horror. We have to get out of here. I clutched Elsie fiercely to my chest. Simon, we need to hide somewhere until the authorities get that woman. My neighbor gave a curt nod and reached for his cell phone, but before he could punch in the first digit, a malevolent voice sliced through the tension like a razor. Oh, I don't think so, Mother. Marlene emerged from the shadows in the hallway behind us, her feral gaze boring into mine with psychotic intensity. In her hand she gripped a wicked-looking blade, its serrated edge glinting with sick menace. One more step, she seethed in a guttural rasp. And I swear on all that's holy, you'll never see your precious granddaughter alive again. Ice water flooded my veins as I froze to the spot, Elsie whimpering into my shoulder like a frightened mouse. Derek lunged with futile rage, but Marlene casually swatted him aside with a dismissive backhand. Stay down, you simpering fool, she spat, her voice dripping with unbridled contempt. This is what happens when you let bleeding heart sentiments cloud your judgment. With a deep, shuddering breath, I hugged Elsie as close as I could and faced my deranged daughter-in-law. Whatever you want, Marlene. Please, just don't hurt her. Haven't you put her through enough torment? Something shifted in those hateful eyes. A bitter, twisted smile split her features as she let out a grating chuckle that raised the hairs on my neck. Torment? You think this is about torment? Marlene's free hand clutched her chest in a pantomime of tortured anguish. This was her salvation, her one chance to claw past the curse of mediocrity that afflicts our bloodline. She took a jerking step closer, pressing the cold steel against my cheek, its razor edge biting my flesh. I held my ground, staring her down as Elsie sobbed into my neck. I gave her the gift you were never strong enough to give Derek, Marlene hissed through gritted teeth. The gift of my relentless drive, my burning ambition, a righteous obsession, to escape the shackles of a meaningless, forgotten existence. A solitary tear traced down her cheek as her impassioned tirade reached its crescendo. But you had to defile that sacred commitment, didn't you? Poisoning her mind with your sickening, weak-willed compassion. She pulled the blade away and took a lurching step backwards, her whole body quivering. I watched in mute horror as the woman teetered on the edge of total madness, for my own fear rendered insignificant next to the safety of my granddaughter. In that suspended moment, Elsie lifted her head and met my gaze with luminous, imploring eyes. Without a single word, that child conveyed everything I needed to hear in that soul-rending stare. The torment, the deprivation, the shredding of all joy and hope and identity inflicted by her own mother's callous obsession. I didn't hesitate. Gathering my courage, I thrust Elsie into Derek's arms and turned to face Marlene squarely. "Get out!" The demented woman blinked, her tirade fading into sheer dumbfounded rage. "What did you say to me?" "You heard me," I bellowed, taking a bold step forward. "I want you out of my family's life once and for all. Your poison has done enough damage, you deranged witch." Marlene's mouth contorted into a hideous sneer. "The damage is only beginning, you meddling old crone." She lunged with feral abandon, swinging the blade in a vicious horizontal arc. I ducked just in time, reeling backwards as the razor-sharp edge sliced through the air where my neck had been. "Mom?" Derek launched himself at Marlene with a guttural roar, but she swatted him away like a fly. The blade planted itself into the wall as she wrestled him to the ground. "You're as pathetic as she says." Marlene spat, raining blows down on Derek's head. "Just a sad, useless shell of a man." I acted on pure instinct. Grabbing an antique globe from the end table, I wound up and swung the heavy orb squarely at the back of Marlene's skull. It connected with a sickening crunch, sending her sprawling to the side. My chest heaved with exertion as I glared down at the crumpled, barely conscious heap that had once been my daughter-in-law. "Somebody get the authorities on the line," I rasped, spitting out the words like daggers. "Before I do something we'll all regret." A dismal, haunting silence swallowed us all. The battle for Elsie's soul had reached its bloody culmination, but at what cost? When the police finally arrived, the scene must have painted a ghastly picture of domestic carnage. Derek slumped against the wall, semi-conscious and spattered with blood. Marlene bound with zip ties and muttering incoherently on the floor. And me, Lorraine Ellis, clutching my sobbing granddaughter with a vice-like grip as the madness of the past few hours finally caught up to all of us. The officers had to practically pry Elsie from my arms to assess her condition. As they loaded Marlene into the back of their cruiser like a rabid animal, she let out one final tortured howl that sent chills down my spine. "You'll all be forgotten," she screeched, writhing against her restraints. Nameless vagrants wasting away in the gutter with the rest of the talentless nobodies. Then she was gone, like a living nightmare being hauled away. But her lingering malice hung over us all with palpable dread. What now? Where did we go from this point? Over the next few days, the fallout from Marlene's explosive unraveling rippled through our quiet community in waves. Derek resolved to take an extended leave of absence from work to be with Elsie and enter family therapy to process the trauma. Meanwhile, Marlene faced a firestorm of legal troubles. Her assault charges were compounded by allegations of child abuse and imprisonment uncovered during the investigation. The judge ultimately ruled that she should undergo mandatory psychiatric evaluation and counseling to determine the threat she posed to her own daughter. Perhaps the most shocking development was the swift and merciless backlash from our once idyllic neighborhood. Word spread like wildfire about Marlene's deranged obsession and the lengths she went to transform Elsie into a musical prodigy. Suddenly, the woman who everyone thought was just an overachieving tiger mom became persona non grata, a cautionary tale of parenthood gone horrifically wrong. People I had known for years now openly shunned me and Derek in the streets, as if the curse of Marlene's insanity might somehow rub off on us. The cruelest judgments, however, were reserved for poor Elsie. "Did you hear about the Bennett girl? What a shame, such a waste of talent." "You know her mother was grooming her for Juilliard from birth? Can you imagine the pressure? No wonder the girl cracked. Apple doesn't fall far from the tree, as they say." Though they tried to shield her, the whispers and sideways glances cut Elsie deeper than any blade. The idea that her own mother's delusional ambition had somehow indelibly stained her future potential was a shadow she couldn't escape. At least not by staying in this town much longer. It was around this time that Simon, bless his ornery heart, stepped up with a proposition. His sister happened to manage a ranch in a remote part of Montana where Derek and Elsie could live off the grid for as long as they needed to heal. A chance to make a clean break and start totally anew. Though I longed for them to stay nearby, I knew it was the wisest path forward. So with a heavy heart, I began making preparations to send my loved ones off to greener pastures, far from the toxic legacy Marlene had bequeathed to us all. As I stood in the driveway hugging Elsie goodbye, I fought back hot tears. This wasn't a McKenna family tradition I ever wanted to repeat, watching the next generation flee their trauma to find hope elsewhere. But if that's what it took to free my granddaughter from the shackles of her mother's madness, then so be it. No sacrifice was too great to redeem Elsie's shattered spirit. "I love you, sweetheart," I whispered, cradling her face in my hands. Her vacant eyes glistened with a lifetime's worth of hurt and confusion. "No matter where life takes you, I'll always be here when you need me." She nodded wordlessly, shuffling toward the waiting truck. As the engine sputtered to life and they pulled away, I felt a profound sense of resolution wash over me. By sheer grit and the grace of heaven itself, I had kept my vow. Marlene's toxic reign of terror had ended. All that remained was to help Elsie rediscover the joy that had been so cruelly robbed from her childhood. With Derek and Elsie securely on their way to a fresh start in Montana, I steeled myself for the battles still to come. Though Marlene was behind bars awaiting her fate, I knew a vile woman like her wouldn't go down without an explosive fight. My prediction proved correct when Marlene's preliminary hearing kicked off a firestorm of sensationalist media coverage. Overnight, our sleepy suburb found itself thrust into the national spotlight as armchair pundits and sanctimommies engaged in a fervent public debate. This tiger mom obviously took her parenting approach too far. Are we really going to start jailing mothers for being too demanding of their children's potential? If she genuinely believed she was doing what was best for her kid, where do we draw the line between strict and psychotic? The furor reached stratospheric heights when excerpts from Marlene's psych evaluation leaked, revealing the true pathological depths of her delusions. Her obsession with transforming Elsie into a musical superstar was rooted in unresolved trauma from her own childhood. Marlene had been bred from birth as the heir to her mother's musical legacy, just another link in the chain to perpetuate a dynastic myth of artistic supremacy. But when she failed to live up to those impossible expectations, her family swiftly discarded her like so much disposable trash. For years she drifted rudderless, grasping for any sense of purpose or belonging. Then Elsie was born, and Marlene saw her chance to resurrect the crushed dreams of her own youth, to finally seize the validation and reverence that had been mercilessly denied to her. Having a child unlocked the floodgates to all her repressed psychoses. But it also amplified the warped principles seared into her psyche from an early age, namely, that perfection and greatness transcend any moral considerations of personal well-being. To Marlene, sacrificing her own child's independence and identity on the altar of achievement wasn't just acceptable, it was a sacred obligation that no casual parent could ever truly grasp. As her disturbing manifesto played out on every news channel and social media feed, the collective outrage only swelled in intensity. Suddenly, Marlene wasn't just emblematic of overbearing parental zeal run amok. She was the very embodiment of sadistic narcissism taken to its ugly extreme. No one exemplified that backlash more than Marlene's own family, the very architects of her childhood torment. In a bombshell interview, her estranged father stepped forward to denounce his daughter's unforgivable atrocities. His words were as chilling as they were damning. "We gave Marlene every opportunity for greatness. Tutors, training camps, the finest facilities, anything to cultivate the talent she proved deficient in harnessing. When she failed us despite those privileges, we were forced to cut her loose in disgrace. How she's chosen to inflict that same misery upon an innocent child only proves she learned nothing from the mistakes of her coddled upbringing." In a dark twist of symmetry, Marlene now found herself utterly disowned by the vicious legacy she had so desperately craved. Her ambitions atomized in the face of a jury's unsparing judgment. Guilty. Guilty on charges of child abuse, false imprisonment, and criminal endangerment. The prosecutor's summation cast Marlene as a raving Medea, willing to commit unspeakable atrocities to satisfy her delusional hunger for vicarious glory. As the guilty verdict was read, I couldn't help but feel a pang of pity for the broken, hollowed-out soul shuddering before the bench. In that moment, Marlene Bennett ceased being a monster and simply became pathetic, a sad mirror of how far wounded pride and self-deception can twist the human spirit. The judge showed no such leniency. After scathing federal prosecutors demanded the maximum sentence, Marlene was remanded to a secure psychiatric facility for the next 10 to 20 years, pending mandatory therapy and observation to determine if she still posed a threat to herself and others once her debt to society was paid. It was a fate worse than any conventional prison could inflict. Marlene would be chemically neutered, cauterized of any agency to stoke her warped aspirations of glory, left to rot in an anonymous limbo, drained of the delirious fuel that allowed her grandiose sense of purpose to metastasize in the first place. Yet as the disgraced woman was led away in shackles, her final act shocked even me. Straining against the grip of her escorting officers, Marlene locked her wild eyes onto mine from across the courtroom gallery. "This isn't over, you smug old harpy," she shrieked with unhinged fury. "Your family will be forgotten in mediocrity and failure just like mine. Mark my words." The outburst earned her a sharp blow to the gut that doubled her over. But even then, her hateful glare remained locked onto me with unsettling intensity, as if issuing an unspoken curse that no prison could ever contain. I had won this battle, saved Elsie from her mother's noxious grip. But at what cost? Though Marlene was in custody, the scars of her abuse would take years to heal, perhaps even spanning generations. With a weary sigh and a heavy heart, I left the carnage of the courtroom behind and set my sights forward. My family's road to recovery was just beginning, after all. The following months passed by in a disorienting whirlwind. With Marlene locked away and Derek dedicated to rebuilding his life with Elsie out west, I was left to pick up the scattered pieces of our shattered existence back home. It wasn't easy. Despite the urban legends that now swirled about the horrors that unfolded under my own roof, the fact remained that most folks still saw me as the well-meaning oldster whose granddaughter was simply collateral damage to her mother's insanity. In other words, pity mixed with more than a hint of disdainful gossip became the brand our family wore like a scarlet letter around town. Grocery clerks who had known me for decades suddenly went cold and aloof. Neighbors stopped waving from across the street. Even Simon retreated behind the isolating walls of his run-down bachelor pad. I understood their reticence, of course. Proximity to the macabre incidents of Marlene's unmaking had become radioactive by association. Still, the loneliness haunted my daily existence like a lingering malaise, with my only haven coming from the occasional phone call giving meager updates on Elsie and Derek's progress out in Montana. "She still won't utter a single word," Derek confided during one such heart-wrenching chat. "Hasn't drawn anything or even cracked a smile since we arrived. It's like part of her soul remains trapped back in that house of horrors." My heart ached for the burdens those two carried, even separated from the source of their strife. I vowed to help them both keep putting one foot in front of the other, no matter how treacherous the path ahead might seem. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, some 6 months after their departure, an unexpected miracle arrived at my doorstep. It was a plain manila envelope, unstamped, likely hand-delivered by a local mail carrier. My name scrawled across the front in childlike penmanship that instantly made my heart skip a beat. Elsie. With trembling hands, I tore open the clasp and upended the contents onto my kitchen counter. What spilled out was a drawing. A meticulously detailed pencil sketch of a young woman with sunken eyes, hollowed cheeks, and a beatific smile tugging at the edges of her lips. At first glance, I didn't recognize the gaunt, haunted visage staring back at me from the page. But as my eyes roamed the delicate strokes of graphite that composed her wispy brown hair, the faded floral print of her frayed house dress, a sob hitched in my throat. It was me. My own weary face rendered with soul-lancing tenderness and empathy through the prism of Elsie's wounded psyche. Fresh tears sprang anew when I finally registered the tiny words etched into the bottom corner of the picture. My savior. That was the spark I needed to energize me back into productive motion for the first time in months. If this heartfelt gesture was any indication, then Elsie's once vibrant spirit was finally stirring back to life out there on that distant ranch. That very night, I sprang into a whirlwind of activity, arranging travel plans and logistics for an extended trip to visit them both over the winter holidays. No more fragmentary phone calls or letters would suffice to track my granddaughter's step-by-step recovery. I needed to see it with my own eyes, to hold her renewed joy in my arms. The weeks blurred together like frames of an old home movie reel as my departure date steadily approached. Before I knew it, I stood bundled on the windswept front porch, suitcase in hand, and greeted by the grinning, rosy-cheeked face of Simon. "You didn't think I was going to let you make that whole trek alone, did ya?" The gruff loner smiled from beneath his faded cap before nodding toward the battered Ford idling at the curb. "Now come on. Nothing but wide-open road between here and there." My heart swelled with profound gratitude for my newfound friend's enduring devotion. After exchanging a teary hug, I hurried to join him for the long journey toward healing and rebirth. Glancing back at the battered facade of the house one final time, I felt the shadows of old torments recede like a long, fitful nightmare finally slipping away. Though formidable challenges still lay ahead, the glimmer of hope that Elsie had rediscovered her fighting spirit was the balm I needed to carry on. No matter how long it took, no matter what hurdles arose, I would be there for her restoration. The guardian she needed to guide her back into the warm light of joy and self-discovery. This time, permanently freed from the shackles of her mother's poisonous ambition. With Simon's van, now bound for the winding roads of deliverance, I allowed my spirit to soar ahead with the winds of optimism and renewal. My mission had reached its apex, and the rays of a new dawn beckoned on the horizon. Elsie's torment was over. At long last, the cycle was broken.
I didn't ask to be born into this particular family. Hell, I never even requested to be born. However, here I am, Michelle the unwanted, the eldest child of a failed union. Divorce-related resentment taints my earliest memories. I had just outgrown my diapers when my parents divorced. Mom had remarried to a man named Tom by the time I was 3 years old. I suppose Tom wasn't all bad. He was a doting father who lavished gifts and affection onto my mother. However, it was immediately apparent that I was merely extra baggage that was included in the bundle. That is, until I was 5 years old. When Mom became pregnant, everything in the world seemed to center around the adorable baby that was growing inside her. Tom was ecstatic, gushing nonstop about his child as if I didn't exist. I could have easily passed for invisible on the day my sister Emily was born. Tom cooed and made faces I'd never seen before, holding her like she was made of glass. Mother glowed with pride, as though she was holding her firstborn. "Michelle," my mother continued, acknowledging my existence at last, "please come meet your baby sister. You'll be of great assistance to her." Looking through the bundle of blankets, I saw a red, wrinkled face that resembled a potato rather than a newborn. I muttered, "Hi," not experiencing the immediate connection that everyone seemed to be expecting. That was the last day of my childhood. I was Emily's big sister, her little helper, her built-in babysitter. I was no longer just Michelle. "Michelle, watch your sister while I make dinner." "Michelle, can you change Emily's diaper?" "Michelle, why don't you read Emily a bedtime story?" It never came to an end. The same thing would always come up when I tried to slink away to play with my friends or just spend some alone time. "Michelle, where are you? Emily requires your help." That little whiny thing that had taken my position in the family made me grow to hate it. But every time I even hinted at being frustrated, I was treated with disillusionment and lectures. Mom used to say, "You're a big girl now, Michelle," in a firm voice. "Now is the moment to behave accordingly. You must serve as a positive role model for Emily. Yes, Tom would add, you ought to be appreciative that you have a little sister who is so amazing. Some young people would kill to have the chance. And so started the cycle that would come to characterize my childhood, constantly prioritizing Emily over my own needs and desires. I was Michelle, the caregiver, the assistant, and the girl who was unseen. The division in our family deepened as Emily grew older. By the time I was 12, and she was 7, it was obvious to me too who was the favorite child. One day, Mom said, Michelle, Emily needs your room for her art and music. You'll be moving into her old room this weekend. I looked at her, astonished. That's my room, though. I've got it since I was a young child. Tom intervened, his tone now condescending. Michelle, you have enough maturity to comprehend. More room is needed for Emily's activities. Her easel and synthesizer are quite large. What about my things? I made a feeble protest. Where will I put my books? Mom cut in. You'll make it work. Emily's abilities require development. Don't you want to stand by your sister? Once more, everything was there. The guilt trip and the expectation that I would give up everything for Emily without raising any objections. Biting my tongue, I nodded while holding back the tears. My already shaky sense of belonging took yet another hit after the relocation. Naturally, Emily was overjoyed, smiling at me as I stuffed my items into the tiny space that used to be hers. She pranced around her new, large room. Emily's preferential treatment only became more obvious as we grew older. She made the most of her ability to get away with anything because she knew she could. I saw her slyly taking cash out of Tom's wallet one day. Emily, I growled. What are you doing? All she did was smile and put a finger to her lips. Cease. Michelle, don't be such a rat. When Tom found the missing money later that night, chaos ensued. He yelled, $20. Who took $20 from my wallet? Before I could say anything, Emily blurted out, I saw Michelle near your room earlier. As her eyes widened in fear. Everybody looked at me. I stumbled to say, I didn't. But Emily interrupted. She said, check her backpack, in a tone that was laced with faux worry. Tom stormed over and ripped open my school bag, much to my horror. There was a $5 bill tucked inside a side pocket. Michelle. Mom let out a gasp. How could you? I didn't take it. When I realized what Emily had done too late, I sobbed. I swear it wasn't me. But my objections were ignored. I was made to perform additional tasks, given a month-long grounding, and given endless lectures about responsibility and trust. Emily, meanwhile, was grinning smugly and enjoying her win. That night, as I lay in my too-small bed in my too-small room, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, always the scapegoat, always the afterthought. I needed to find a way out. High school became my ticket to freedom. While Emily coasted through on charm and our parents' doting attention, I buried myself in books and extracurriculars. Every A on my report card, every academic achievement, was a step closer to independence. The day I received my college acceptance letter was the happiest of my life. Full scholarship, dormitory included, I was getting out. The summer before college, I picked up a job at a local cafe. Every dollar I'd earned went into a secret savings account. Never again would I be financially dependent on my family. Moving day arrived, and I couldn't pack fast enough. As I lugged my suitcases to the car, Emily lounged in the doorway, smirking. Have fun at loser college, she drawled. Try not to bore everyone to death with your nerdiness. I bit back a retort. In a few hours, I'd be free of her taunts. College was everything I'd hoped for and more. For the first time, I was judged on my own merits, not constantly compared to my sister. I threw myself into my classes, determined to make the most of this opportunity. My human resources management program was challenging but fascinating. I loved learning about organizational behavior, talent acquisition, and conflict resolution. Ironically, my dysfunctional family had given me plenty of real-world experience in those areas. Between classes and studying, I kept my job at a cafe near campus. The work was exhausting, but every paycheck felt like a victory. This was my money, earned by my own efforts. Holidays were awkward. I returned home to find Emily the center of attention as always. She was in high school and apparently excelling in her social life, if not her studies. Michelle, Mom would say during one of our infrequent phone calls, her voice dripping with false cheer. Why don't you tell us about school? Any boys in your life? I'd give them the bare minimum of information, counting the hours until I could return to campus. My real life, my real self, was there now. Graduation day arrived before I knew it. As I stood in my cap and gown, diploma in hand, I felt a surge of pride. I'd done it. Despite everything, I'd succeeded. My family was there, looking slightly out of place among the celebrating crowds. Emily rolled her eyes at the ceremony. God, this is boring, she muttered. Can we go eat now? I ignored her, posing for photos with my roommates and favorite professors. These were the people who had supported me, who had seen my potential. They were my real family now. Fresh out of college, I landed a job as a human resources manager at a large company. As I scrolled through apartment listings, my heart sank. Even the tiniest studios were way out of my budget. Michelle, Mom said during one of our infrequent phone calls, why don't you move back home just until you get on your feet? You won't have to pay rent. Just help out around the house a bit. Against my better judgment, I agreed. It was supposed to be temporary, just until I saved enough for my own place. I should have known better. From the moment I moved back in, it was like I'd never left. Emily was still the golden child, now in college, fully paid for by our parents. I, on the other hand, was right back to being Cinderella. Michelle, can you start dinner? We're starving, Mom would call out the moment I walked in from work. Michelle, the bathroom needs cleaning, Tom would announce, not bothering to lift a finger himself. I'd come home exhausted from a full day at the office, only to face hours of cooking and cleaning. Meanwhile, Emily lounged on the couch, scrolling through her phone and complaining about how hard her life was. I bit my tongue so often I'm surprised it didn't fall off. This wasn't what I'd agreed to, but every time I tried to protest, they reminded me that I lived here rent-free. Then came the bombshell. Emily, barely into her sophomore year, announced she was getting married to a guy 10 years older than her. No less. Isn't it romantic? She gushed, flashing her enormous diamond ring. Jason is so successful, he says I don't even need to finish college. I watched in disbelief as our parents fawned over Emily and her fiancé. They threw themselves into wedding planning with gusto, sparing no expense. I couldn't help but wonder if they'd be this generous if it were my wedding. But of course, in their eyes, I was destined to be the spinster daughter, too focused on work to find a man. The wedding was a lavish affair. I stood beside Emily as her bridesmaid, plastering on a fake smile as I watched my parents beam with pride. This was everything they'd ever wanted for their favorite daughter. After a honeymoon in the Maldives, another gift from our parents, Emily and Jason moved into a rented apartment. I thought maybe things would improve at home without Emily's constant presence. I was wrong. A few months later, Emily showed up on our doorstep, glowing with news. "I'm pregnant." She squealed as my parents erupted in joyous celebration. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Somehow, I knew this would complicate my life even further. Sure enough, over the next few months, I was roped into helping Emily prepare for the baby. Shopping trips, doctor's appointments, setting up the nursery, all on top of my job and household chores. When my nephew was born, Emily and Jason were over at our house constantly. More messes for me to clean, more mouths for me to feed. "Isn't it wonderful?" Mom said, cradling her grandson. "Our family is growing." I looked around at the chaos. Toys strewn about, dishes piled in the sink, my work papers shoved aside to make room for baby gear. This wasn't my family, not really, and this definitely wasn't my life. A year had passed since the birth of Emily's son. I'd settled into a routine, balancing my job with the endless chores at home. It wasn't ideal, but I was making it work. Then came the dinner that would change everything. "Michelle," Mom said, her tone unusually serious, "we need to discuss something. Your sister's moving back home with Jason and the baby. They can't afford their place anymore." I waited for the other shoe to drop. It didn't take long. "We need you to move out," Tom said bluntly. "By the end of the week." The fork clattered from my hand. "What? But where am I supposed to go?" "You're a grown woman with a job," Mom said dismissively. "You'll figure it out." Anger and fear rose in me, tears bubbling up inside. "Why is it always about Emily?" I exploded. "Why do you always choose her over me?" "Don't be selfish, Michelle," Tom snapped. "Your sister has a family to support. You're alone. You can manage on your own." "Selfish?" I repeated, incredulous. "I've done nothing but sacrifice for this family for years." Mom's eyes narrowed. "Well, we won't be needing your sacrifices anymore, or your services as a maid for that matter." In a daze, I packed my belongings. There wasn't much. Most of the furniture belonged to my parents. Tears streamed down my face as I lugged my suitcases to my car, but I refused to let them see me break. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of Emily's car pulling into the driveway. She gave me a little wave, her expression a mix of triumph and happiness. I found a small apartment across town, barely more than a studio. It was all I could afford on such short notice. As I unpacked my meager belongings, a strange sense of peace washed over me. For the first time in my life, I was truly on my own. Days turned into weeks. I threw myself into my work, determined to prove I could make it on my own. To my surprise, I found I was happier than I'd been in years. No one to clean up after, no one to cook for, no one needing to put me before my own. 2 years flew by in a whirlwind of hard work and dedication. My efforts hadn't gone unnoticed. I was promoted to Chief Recruitment Manager, a position that came with a significant pay bump and a lot more responsibility. I moved to a nicer apartment closer to work, filling it with furniture I'd chosen myself. No hand-me-downs, no compromises, just my style, my space. It felt like freedom. I'd finally found some peace away from the constant drama of my family. Then, out of the blue, my phone rang. Emily's name flashed on the screen. "Michelle." Her voice was syrupy sweet. "I need a favor. Jason's looking for a new job. I was hoping you could help him out at your company." I sighed. Of course, it wasn't a social call. "I can look into it," I said cautiously, "but I can't promise anything." When Jason's resume landed in my inbox, I did my due diligence. I found a few entry-level positions that matched his qualifications and passed them along. "These are beneath me," Jason scoffed when I called to discuss the options. "Don't you have anything better?" I bit back a retort. "These are the positions available that match your experience. Take it or leave it." He left it. A few weeks later, I heard through the office vine that Jason had landed a cushy job at our biggest competitor as head of sales. I nearly choked on my coffee when I heard. How the hell did that happen? I muttered to myself. It didn't take long to find out. Mom let it slip during one of our infrequent phone calls. "Oh, your father pulled some strings," she said casually. "He knows someone on their board of directors. Isn't it wonderful? Jason's doing so well." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. All those years of hard work, of proving myself, and my parents had never once offered to help me. But for Jason, they'd move mountains. I wanted to scream, to confront them about the unfairness of it all. But what would be the point? They'd never see it my way. So I swallowed my anger and said nothing. A month passed. I threw myself into my work, trying to forget about Jason and my family's blatant favoritism. Then came the call that would change everything. "Michelle." Jason's voice was low, conspiratorial. "I need your help with something." "What is it?" I asked, wary. "I need some information. Customer lists, pricing details. You know, the good stuff." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Are you asking me to steal confidential information?" "Come on, it's not stealing," he cajoled. "Just sharing between family." "That's corporate espionage, Jason. It's illegal." He laughed as if I told a particularly funny joke. "No one will know it came from you. I'll make it worth your while. We'll split the commission." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Absolutely not. Don't ever ask me something like this again." "Don't be so uptight," he pressed. "Think about Emily. About your nephew. Don't you want to help your family?" That was the last straw. "If you ever contact me about this again, I'm going straight to the police," I snapped. "And don't you dare use my sister or nephew to manipulate me." I hung up, my hands shaking with rage. How dare he? But I had a sickening feeling that this was far from over. A week after Jason's disturbing phone call, I was buried in paperwork when my assistant buzzed me. "Miss Carter, your sister and her husband are here to see you." I froze, a chill running down my spine. This wasn't a coincidence. "Send them in," I said, my mind racing. Emily bounced in, all smiles and chatter, with Jason following close behind. Surprise! We were in the neighborhood and thought we'd drop by. As they settled into the chairs across from my desk, I silently texted our head of security. "Keep an eye on Jason. Suspicious activity possible." "So how have you been?" Emily gushed, launching into a monologue about her son's latest achievements. I nodded along, half listening, my attention focused on Jason. He was fidgety, his eyes darting around my office. Suddenly, he stood up. "Sorry, where's your restroom?" "Down the hall to the left," I said, watching him hurry out. The moment the door closed, Emily leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh my gosh, Michelle. You'll never believe what happened at the grocery store yesterday." As Emily prattled on about her mundane grocery store adventure, my suspicion grew. She was trying too hard to keep my attention, her story unnecessarily detailed and animated. My hand inched toward the silent alarm button under my desk. And then the cashier called the manager, and you won't believe what he said. Emily continued, her eyes darting to the door and back to me. I pressed the alarm. Within seconds, I heard commotion in the hallway. Emily's eyes widened. What's going on? We rushed out of my office to find chaos. Security guards were wrestling Jason to the ground outside the sales director's office, scattered papers littering the floor around them. Let go of me, Jason yelled, struggling against the guards. This is a misunderstanding. Emily screamed, rushing toward her husband. What are you doing? Let him go. I stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. The police arrived minutes later, taking statements from everyone involved. I told them everything. Jason's phone call, his request for confidential information, my suspicions about today's visit. I was called into the director's office early the following morning. I was perspiring when I knocked on the door. Michelle, the director stated, indicating that I should take a seat. I would like to thank you for what you did yesterday. Your integrity and fast thinking saved our organization from a potentially catastrophic security incident. I released a breath that I had been unable to recognize. I'm grateful, sir. I was only carrying out my duties. He gave a nod of approval. That's the kind of commitment we look for in this place. Indeed, I believe it's time for us to talk about your future with the organization. An hour later, when I was leaving his office, I had 3 things on my mind: a raise, a promotion, and a commendation in my file. It was all I had hoped for and everything for which I had labored. But as I sat at my computer and looked at the family portrait that I had preserved through it all, I couldn't help but wonder, what would happen to my family next, and at what cost this achievement came. My phone kept ringing the morning after the incident. Before I even glanced at the screen, I knew who it was. I took a big breath and replied, "Michelle." Mom exclaimed in a high pitch, "What have you done?" Tom's voice roared through the speaker before I could reply. "Michelle, you must make this right. Right now." They abused me for the next hour, insisting that I retract my evidence and accept responsibility for Jason's deeds. Mom urged, "Think about your sister. Consider your nephew. Their lives will be ruined by you. And what about you?" Tom added his voice. "Without a spouse or children, you are all alone. You'll be able to handle all of these difficulties more easily than Jason will." A well-known sensation intensified in my chest, the burden of their anticipation threatening to topple me. However, something wasn't the same this time. I was unique. "No," I said in a firm voice. "I refuse to participate. Jason disobeyed the law. He must accept the repercussions." A startled hush ensued, and then the rant started again. "You ungrateful child." Mom screamed. "After everything we've done for you." Tom snarled. "That's it. You are not our daughter. After we're gone, don't count on a penny." The call ended. I sat there feeling very light, phone in hand. It was over, really over, at last. The following several months flew by. Jason was accused of industrial espionage, attempted burglary, and trespassing. His reputation was destroyed, and he lost his work. Emily amazingly avoided prosecution. I gave my effort my all since I was determined to disprove my parents. Their money and support were not needed by me. It was sufficient that I had myself. Word spread between mutual contacts. After serving his sentence, Jason turned to alcohol since he was jobless. Emily started a string of misadventures after losing hope in her fallen prince. The tipping point was reached when Jason discovered her having sex with someone else in my parents' home, no less. Following the altercation, Jason was left on the street and Emily received divorce papers. Emily brought all of her new lovers to my parents' house, where she stayed. They kicked her out the same way they kicked me out not too long after they'd had enough. My parents took on the role of raising their grandson after she lost custody of her son. I waited for the sense of satisfaction and vindication that I had always imagined I would experience when I heard each piece of news. However, it never materialized. Rather, I experienced nothing at all. Their turmoil was not mine, and they were no longer my family. Years went by. My diligence and moral character paid off in ways I could never have predicted as I moved up the business ladder. Then I met him on a Tuesday that was just like any other. Mark was benevolent, encouraging, and a world away from the poisonous environment I had grown up in. Everything I had never known I wanted. A year later, he proposed, and I said yes right away. Just Mark's family and our closest friends attended our tiny, private wedding. I realized that I had finally found the unwavering love and acceptance I had been looking for as I stood there saying my vows. It's been years since I spoke to Emily or my parents. I occasionally worry about them and my nephew, but I choose not to ask. Some bridges are meant to remain burned.
My parents were living with us until my husband Andrew, who is a little older than I am, requested me to move out of our house recently. I was surprised and perplexed by his abrupt demand. He even threatened to file for divorce from me if I refused to comply with his demands. He had been more reclusive over the last 2 weeks, and our relationship had grown resentful of one another. Even though I paid $2,900 a month for all of our living expenditures, he appeared to simply ignore this. He said, for reasons I couldn't quite understand, that his parents wouldn't be comfortable having me around. I was very taken aback, but I gave in to his demand, packed my things, and walked out, seeing a look of satisfaction on his face. I called a resale store right away to have my belongings managed after I left. I'm Isabella, and my spouse Andrew is my housemate. After initially connecting through mutual connections, we soon became friends. He mentioned in one of our early meetings that he wanted to be a voice actor, which intrigued me because of his endearing voice. We exchanged phone numbers, started hanging out regularly, and before long, even though we never declared our relationship, we were in a relationship. I was drawn to the concept of dating someone older since, at the time, I had just graduated from college, and it felt like I was entering a more responsible stage of my life. Since Andrew is 4 years older than me, my best friend Doris expressed reservations about the age difference. I comforted her by saying that many relationships work well despite age differences. Since Andrew seemed to feel the same way, I didn't see why I should be concerned because I was actually enjoying his company. Following almost 2 years of courtship, the subject of marriage was raised. My parents were intrigued about him when I told them about our age difference and presented him to them. All these talking about the future, I was always wondering when he would pop the question. He did eventually, one evening spent casually in my apartment. Although it wasn't an extravagant romantic gesture, it was sincere and signaled a fresh start for us. Andrew asked so casually, I just said, "Sure, let's get married," in response to his proposal. It was a good reflection of our easygoing lifestyle, which worked well for us both. We took excursions to see each other's family after the proposal, but I wasn't exactly comfortable around Andrew's family. Their house was overflowing with what looked like antiques, but I had a sneaking suspicion they were just copies. Andrew's parents wore opulent branded apparel and flashy jewelry when I first met them, perfectly capturing the look of a well-to-do marriage. It soon became clear that our ideals and tastes were completely different. It was shocking when Andrew's mother made a negative comment about my appearance, but I told myself that as long as Andrew and I were happy, I wouldn't have to spend much time with his family. We moved into a condo after the wedding, but I realized Andrew was being strangely nervous. He asked a curious question one day about a woman from our wedding who was wearing a blue dress. I said, perplexed, that there were multiple visitors dressed in blue. He clarified that he was inquiring about the person who had delivered a speech, even though he wasn't sure who he meant. He knew he meant Doris, my best friend. I verified it, observing that she had on a blue dress. When Andrew inquired about her, it seemed strange that he was interested in her. He explained that he thought he had seen someone who looked like her recently and remembered her speech. It seemed strange that he was suddenly interested in Doris, but before I could ask him more questions, he just laughed it off and went back to his room. Doris called later with some great news. Her lover was going to come home to the U.S. the following year. They have a long and profound bond, having known each other since elementary school and becoming a couple in high school. During middle school, Doris's boyfriend had moved away, but they continued to correspond via letters. When they got back together in high school, he told her he loved her. Doris constantly told romantic stories that I loved to hear. After spending some time in the U.S., her lover was transferred to an international branch and had been working there for a number of years. Their constant communication helped them maintain their great relationship in spite of their distance from one another. I was curious to know if Doris felt her boyfriend would pop the question when he got back, implying that they would get married. Doris laughed at my premature announcement, but said jokingly that I should be ready to deliver a speech that would stand out at her wedding, just as she did at mine. We relaxed and had a good time over tea, appreciating how easy our friendship was and how we could talk about anything and know that one other would be there for us. It was at this time that I began to notice adjustments to Andrew's routine. He was arriving home later and later. He responded that just because we were married, it didn't mean he shouldn't work when I made a comment about his late hours. He was still pursuing his dream of being a voice actor, but in order to pay for his lessons, he had to take a number of part-time jobs with little guarantee of success. As a result, I took care of all of our living expenditures, which made it impossible for us to accumulate any savings. It became evident over time that Andrew was not willing to compromise his goals in order to maintain our family's financial security. His long work hours made me more concerned because I thought his part-time job was asking for too much overtime. Andrew brushed off my worries, saying he had everything under control and the extra money was helpful when I raised the possibility that they were overworking him. The chat was quickly halted by his brusque reaction, and I noted that he was now referring to me impersonally as you, rather than by my name. This small adjustment gave our interactions a touch of coldness that made me worry more about where we were going as a couple. When Andrew and I got married, I imagined he would continue to speak to me with kindness. However, following our wedding, his demeanor shifted drastically. His once soothing, deep voice became grating and harsh, an effect I suspected was due to excessive drinking. Considering he was an aspiring voice actor, this lifestyle seemed detrimental to his vocal health, and I worried about his well-being. Despite my concerns, Andrew appeared indifferent and began to distance himself from me, often ignoring me entirely at home. It was around this time that my friend Doris reached out, wanting to discuss something important. Given my personal concerns, I proposed we meet at a private karaoke booth to talk undisturbed. Doris seemed particularly cautious about her choice of room, selecting one that allowed a clear view of the staff from the door. Curious, I asked her why she had chosen this particular spot. She explained that she had felt someone following her ever since she quit her job a month ago. Choosing a room with visibility allowed the staff to keep an eye out for any suspicious individuals who might be lurking nearby. I asked if she had involved the police. Doris replied that she had tried, but without any physical contact or direct threats, the police were limited in how they could help. She planned to discuss the matter with her boyfriend when he returned in a month, but in the meantime, she wanted to confide in someone close by. Doris hadn't seen her stalker clearly, too frightened to make out whether it was a man or a woman. I promised to help her keep a lookout, hoping to identify the person tailing her through my observations. I shockingly discovered that the individual following Doris was none other than my husband, Andrew. Despite his claims of working late, he had been spending his evenings lurking near Doris's workplace, following her after his shifts ended. This revelation was a heavy burden, and while I had planned to discuss my strained relationship with Andrew, uncovering his disturbing behavior became the immediate priority. The situation was far more serious than I had anticipated, leaving me to grapple with both my crumbling marriage and the safety of my dear friend. The day I found out that Andrew was the one stalking Doris was a profound shock, a betrayal that shattered my trust completely. Watching him follow my best friend with a creepy, unsettling grin was chilling. I had loved and married this man, but in that instant, my feelings evaporated, leaving a cold void where affection once resided. I immediately confided in Doris about the discovery, and together we took swift action to ensure her safety. With assistance from her co-workers, arrangements were made for her to be discreetly driven from the underground parking lot of her workplace to her new residence, helping her stay out of Andrew's reach. As Doris and I implemented these security measures, I could see Andrew's irritation mounting. One day, his frustration erupted out of nowhere. Andrew demanded that I leave our home to make room for his parents, threatening divorce if I resisted. His audacity was astounding, especially considering that I was the one covering our living expenses, a hefty $2,900 monthly. I wondered if he even remembered or cared about that fact as I stared at him incredulously. His patience snapped, and he lost his temper completely, shouting for me to leave so his parents could move in. Stunned yet resolute, I replied, "Fine, but I'm taking everything I purchased with me." The moment I agreed to leave, Andrew instructed me to hurry. Wasting no time, I contacted a local buyback service to handle the removal of my belongings. When they arrived the next day to assess the items, Andrew watched, initially smug in his assumption that I was simply conceding defeat. However, his smugness quickly turned to shock as he realized that nearly all the furniture in our apartment was being evaluated for removal, furniture that I had paid for. This upheaval underscored the deep rift between us, highlighting not just a failing marriage, but a profound misunderstanding and disrespect that had been festering beneath the surface. As the buyback service carried away piece after piece, it symbolized the dismantling of the life and home we had tried to build together. After the staff finished evaluating all the items in our apartment, excluding those in Andrew's personal room, they presented me with a quote. The total value of the furniture and appliances amounted to $30,000. Without hesitation, I signed the document to proceed with the sale. This decision seemed to snap Andrew back to reality, and in a moment of panic, he grabbed my arm. "Wait, why are you selling everything? My parents are supposed to live here. How will they manage without furniture?" I pulled away from his grasp sharply. "What do you mean?" "When we got married, you were so broke from your acting classes that you practically begged me to cover the rent, the furniture, and all our living expenses. I didn't realize just how broke you were. I feel deceived." I reminded him pointedly about the $2,900 monthly expenses I had been paying. "From now on, you'll need to cover those expenses, especially with your parents moving in. It'll likely be even more," I stated firmly. Andrew's face turned pale, but he quickly tried to regain his composure. "You thought you could bring up money and I'd back out of the divorce? Who do you think you are?" He then defensively added, "I've already found a wealthy woman." Processing Andrew's revelation about his relationship with a wealthy woman, I began to suspect he might be confusing his stalker-like behavior towards Doris as a close relationship. If he considered that closeness, he was severely mistaken. Doris indeed came from a wealthy background. Her grandfather was a successful businessman, and her father now managed the family business. Doris was the epitome of a perfect AYS, Yet she never flaunted her wealth. She lived modestly, just like me and our friends, and no one judged her based on her family's money. It dawned on me that Andrew might have learned about Doris's affluent background and misconstrued it, considering his skewed perception and desperate actions. This understanding added a layer of sadness and irony to the whole situation, revealing not just the dissolution of our marriage, but also the delusions and deceit that had underpinned Andrew's intentions from the start. Andrew's assumption that Doris would be a better match for him because of her wealth was both absurd and infuriating. Wealth does not define someone's value, particularly not in matters of the heart. Yet Andrew seemed to think it did, a notion that only fueled my frustration. I was positive that Doris would never consider getting married to someone with his kind of background. Her boyfriend, with whom she had been in high school, was scheduled to return to the state shortly. "They'll probably get married," I told Andrew, who looked visibly surprised to hear that his pretended intimacy with Doris was really a fantasy. Andrew attempted to defend himself by saying, "But I always walk Doris home," clinging to whatever link he believed to exist. "You should consider yourself lucky you weren't reported to the police," I replied. "But I didn't know she had a boyfriend." Andrew made a feeble protest. Since elementary school, they have been pen friends, and they communicate almost daily. And her boyfriend is a successful man, even acknowledged by her father, unlike you, who've been working part-time jobs, I said, emphasizing the clear differences between him and Doris's boyfriend. While the buyback workers were removing the appliances and furnishings, Andrew was trying to gather his composure. "I suppose all I have left is you." Striking a nice pose, he asked, "You'll support my dream of becoming a voice actor forever, right?" I gave his query a chilly look. "Pardon me?" "I've already begun the divorce procedure by seeing a lawyer. From now on, let's contact our attorneys." Andrew held to my waist, maybe thinking I still felt something for him. "Don't make remarks like that," he begged. "Haven't we been getting along all this time?" "Getting along? You've been distant and hanging around with my best friend Doris ever since you learned that she's a wealthy AYS, I shot back, making it obvious that his behavior were dishonest and self-serving. Everything had fallen apart as a result of his foolish quest of fortune via relationships, and it was now time for me to go on with him while maintaining my dignity and sense of reality. It became clear to me that marrying you was a mistake. Not long after our marriage vows, Andrew broke down in tears, acting more like a kid than a man who was 4 years my senior. The more I watched him cry, the more my feelings for him grew distant. I could no longer even live in the same room as him without feeling suffocated. I stated, "I just can't do this anymore," with a hint of exasperation in my tone. I went on, "By the way, I've spoken to your uncle, the one who owns this apartment, about our divorce." In a matter-of-fact manner. When Andrew realized how serious the issue was, his expression plummeted. "Unclear? But you are aware of his strictness," he shot out, sounding panicked. "Considering that I've been covering our rent and living expenses, your uncle suggested finding you a job when I leave," I replied coolly. "This implies that I will also be unable to continue taking voice acting classes." Practice was scarce for Andrew, and it didn't seem like a good idea to stick with something he wasn't entirely devoted to. "Maybe it's time for you to face reality," I said. I angrily cautioned him, "I won't hesitate to call the police if you bother Doris again." With a solid step, I sealed my resolution and left the house, vowing never to come back. My original intention was to return to my parents' home, but if a better chance came up, I would have looked at moving somewhere closer to my place of employment. About Andrew, soon after we split up, his uncle did in fact help him land a job at his business. It's interesting to note that Andrew's parents moved into the flat and began working for the uncle. They had hoped to gain something from their son's marriage to an affluent family. It appeared that their family was prone to opportunism. Leaving behind such a poisonous setting made me feel relieved. Although I had never been worried by the age gap, the experience made me realize how important it would be to choose my future spouse more carefully. Fortunately, after things with Andrew had calmed down, I got a marriage proposal from Doris. She presented me to her long-term partner, and I genuinely hoped for their happiness. Despite my first marriage's failure, I hoped that Doris and I would have a happy and long-lasting marriage. Daddy, please let the girl who's in the trunk out. I missed my spouse when our 4-year-old daughter uttered those things on a family drive. At that moment, he took a glimpse at me. His face was still pale, whether it was intentional or not. With a terrified expression, he peered at our daughter through the rearview mirror. What a terrifying statement. Such lies belong nowhere. From the passenger seat, I shot him a fierce scowl. Then should we pull over at the rest area? We had been married for 5 years, during which time I had dutifully supported him while he was at work. But the mystical power of my daughter was going to reveal the truth. At the age of 27, I, Charlotte Clark, got married to my husband, Freddie. He is my elder by 4 years. Our daughter Sophia was born the next year. She turned 4 years old today and has been growing up healthy and active. Our family was having a busy yet enjoyable time. How about going to the zoo next Sunday? I inquired. Congrats. I am eager to view the giraffes. I could not help but smile at their jovial exchange. Since our first date, my spouse has always been kind, and our daughter's birth hasn't made that any different. He is a perfect father and voluntarily participates in family activities on his days off. I'm very happy that I found this dude. I was watching my daughter and hubby play together and feeling really happy. I had no idea that these quiet days would soon be coming to an end. Oh, so you're moving to a different department? Yes, that's corporate policy. They desire that I have experience in a variety of settings. One day, Freddie returned home and sighed wearily, his face wearing a gloomy expression. Regretfully, it appeared that he was being moved to the busiest department, which implied that he might not have much time to spend with us. Daddy, are you not going to play with me anymore? Sophia, I'll try to get to know you as much as possible. When is a good time to visit the zoo again? With a sorrowful expression on his face, my husband caressed our nervous daughter's head. I was overcome with emotion as I watched the two of them, and I felt a tightening in my chest. Even though it didn't appear like he was moving or getting paid more, our family was nevertheless quite excited about his transfer. I felt lonely just thinking about spending less time together as a family. But Freddie, getting used to his new surroundings, is undoubtedly the one feeling the most vulnerable. Please don't push yourself too hard. I became concerned about him overdoing it, because I knew he had a propensity to get really involved in things. Regretfully, though, my worries proved to be well-founded. Despite his busy schedule, Freddie was able to make time for his family and himself at first. But a month or so later, he abruptly stopped spending as much time at home. He frequently returned home late at night after our daughter had gone to bed, giving the impression that he was working extra. Not only did he start taking his clients out for drinks more frequently, but he also started working on his days off. I was also concerned about him in another way. Hey, would you be able to take Sunday off? You have been working too hard recently, and Sophia misses you. For whom do you think I'm putting in so much effort? Shall I just decline client meetings and run the chance of losing my job? I was merely concerned about him. That's not how I meant it. Anyway, that's none of your concern. Ensure you have cash ready for the drinking celebration that takes place next week. My spouse had been unhappy all the time and had started venting his frustrations on me more regularly, seemed overwhelmed by his workload. Besides, he was blowing a lot of money and said it was for client entertainment. This was beginning to have an effect on our living costs. I was more concerned about his stiff demeanor than frustrated because I knew of his earlier compassion. He was about to burn out from too much work, so I had to figure out how to make him take a break. My spouse had reached a stage where, after 6 months from the transfer, he was essentially returning home to sleep. Furthermore, Sophia started to wear a dejected expression more frequently since she felt lonely not being able to see him. I was attempting to come up with a plan for him to take a break since I realized that things couldn't continue this way. But even as if to undermine my efforts, misfortune continued to follow. After battling a sickness for a few years, my mother unexpectedly passed away in the hospital. "No! Mom!" exclamation mark. My father had passed away when I was young, and my mother was my only parent. I couldn't even have a proper conversation with her before she passed away. When I heard the news at home, I was so shocked that I couldn't move for a while. However, Freddie's response to me was unbelievably cold. "Hey, do I have to go to that funeral too?" His indifferent attitude shocked me, and I widened my eyes in disbelief. For my husband, the relationship with my mother-in-law may have been somewhat distant, but she was still family. Despite this, he didn't show any sadness or comfort me. Instead, he just complained about having to attend the funeral. "What are you saying? Of course you have to. It's a family funeral. Don't get mad at me. Ugh, why does this have to happen now? I had plans too." Despite my reprimand, Freddie showed no signs of remorse, and I was left shocked. In the past, he would have surely comforted me, perhaps rubbing my back and grieving with me together. But now, as he sighed in dissatisfaction, he seemed nothing like the person I once promised a future with. Naturally, he didn't help with any preparations for my mother's funeral, and I arranged everything alone. On the day of the service, my husband remained silent and sullen. "It's over now, right? I'm heading home first." After the funeral ended, Freddie didn't help with any cleanup and quickly went home. I was initially confused by his reactions, but by then, I had lost the energy to be angry. I was simply bewildered and disappointed in him. No matter how busy and stressed from work he may be, his behavior at the funeral was unacceptable. When did my husband become such a cold person? "Mom, Sophia will help you." Despite feeling frustrated with him, I finished cleaning up with my daughter by my side. Before heading home, I decided to stop by my parents' house for a short while. It wasn't far from our home, and I wanted to reminisce about my mother. After saying goodbye, although I did it as my heart dictated, the decision wasn't wrong. When I arrived at my parents' house with a heavy heart, I discovered something shocking. "Mom, wait a moment." "Huh? Sophia?" As soon as we arrived at my parents' house, my daughter's expression suddenly changed, and she dashed straight into the back room. I had taken her to visit my mother's PLI had never seen her behave like this. Hurrying to follow her, I found Sophia opening the second drawer from the bottom of the dresser, as if she was drawn to it by something. "Mom, Grandma wants you to have this." As I looked at an old hand mirror that my daughter was holding, I couldn't help but catch my breath. The mirror had always been precious to my mother, but she had treasured it so much that even I rarely saw her use it, and I didn't even know where she kept it. Of course, there's no way Sophia could have known about the existence of this hand mirror. "What? How did you know it was here? And what do you mean Grandma wanted me to have it?" "When Grandma was sleeping earlier, she told me that Mom was sad and asked me to give this to you." I couldn't hide my surprise at her innocent answer. I didn't think it was a coincidence, so I asked her some questions. I asked about tomorrow's dinner menu, what I was thinking about, and even thoughts I had during the funeral. All things she couldn't possibly know. Yet to my surprise, she accurately answered every question. I'm not sure how long she has had it, but it seems like my daughter has a mysterious ability to know what people are thinking. Wow, that's amazing, Sophia. You know everything. I stroked her head, feeling bewildered. I had always thought that the idea of mysterious abilities was just something from stories, but I never imagined she actually had such a power. While I was surprised, she put her hand on her hip and showed a proud look on her face. That's right. Sophia knows about Dad, too. What do you mean? What she told me was incredibly unbelievable and unforgivable. A few weeks after my mother's funeral, I was visiting my friend with Sophia next Sunday in the morning. When I told Freddie, who was about to leave for work, he abruptly stopped and frowned, looking genuinely troubled. Really? Oh no, I'm off that day. That's too bad. Feeling the artificiality in his voice, I quietly let out a smile so as not to give myself away. Now that I knew the truth, there was no love left for Freddie inside me. On that Sunday, I left home with Sophia, then killed about an hour before returning home. Dad, he's over there. Then I looked where she pointed and headed towards the garage with the shutter still down. After taking a deep breath, I lightly knocked on the shutter. Freddie, I know you're in there. Open it. Huh? Charlotte, I thought you and Sophia had plans. It's canceled. If you're going somewhere, we want to come with you. He sounded flustered and hesitant to open the shutter. Honestly, I had a pretty good idea of what was going on inside that moment, but I decided to stay quiet and just observe. Sophia wants to go for a drive, too. Unable to resist her hopeful voice, he had no choice but to agree. A few minutes later, Freddie reluctantly opened the garage and started our drive together. Sitting in the passenger seat, I looked at Freddie, who was driving in profile, and I solidified my final decision. The married life with Freddie had truly been enjoyable and happy, but I also firmly understood that those days would never come back. Hey, did you know Sophia has a special power? I finally brought it up as we merged onto the highway. My husband furrowed his brows in confusion at the sudden confession. Huh? What's that supposed to mean? That's a silly joke. He laughed dismissively. Daddy, the girl in the trunk is asking you to let her out. From the back seat, our daughter confidently raised her voice. I didn't miss how my husband steeled his face at that moment. However, whether he intended to play dumb or not, he, whose face was still pale, looked at our daughter through the rearview mirror with a frightened expression. Husband? What a scary thing to say. You shouldn't tell such lies. But it's true. Then should we pull over at the rest area? When I suggested it on behalf of our daughter, who was hanging her head down, Freddie immediately looked at me with a startled expression. Huh? We don't need to do that. It's just a kid's joke. Sophia has a mysterious power, you know. Besides, it's hot today, so it could be dangerous if someone's really in there. He must have thought what I said made sense. After Freddie flinched and stiffened, he headed towards the rest area with a contorted expression on his face. Upon arrival, we left our daughter in the air-conditioned car and went outside to check the trunk. I don't think there's anything in there. Come on, quickly. When I said a word to my husband, who had begun to hesitate at this point, he seemed to realize he couldn't escape anymore and nervously opened the trunk, breaking into a cold sweat. In the next moment, someone jumped out from there. I knew you were cheating. It was a young woman whose face flushed red from the heat. Yes, it turned out that while Sophie and I were out, Freddie had been cheating with her at home. Probably just as they were about to go for a drive, we came back unexpectedly, so he had no choice but to hide her. He shook his head nervously at the woman who was taken away suddenly and seemed unable to grasp the situation. No, it's not like that. She is a colleague from work. We were just working together. Wow, at the new apartment? You're doing a job getting into a trunk? I chuckled at the blatant and ridiculous lie while standing firm and taking a piece of copy paper from my bag. And what is this? It says, Let's go on a drive date on Sunday." As the woman and Freddie looked at the paper, they turned pale. That was no surprise, as their lovey-dovey email exchanges were printed on it. Thanks to Sophia, I found out everything. On the day of my mother's funeral, at my parents' house, my daughter confided in me. "Daddy has been spending a lot of time with Scarlett lately. I'm sad because Scarlett is taking Daddy away from me. Just having witnessed her power made what she said suspicious, so I decided to investigate my husband for a while after that. Sure enough, I found undeniable evidence of his affair on his phone. So I told you that fake plan because I wanted to punish you. It's a shame it turned into this kind of drive." "Hey, it's unfair to look through my phone without permission," Freddie protested, shaking his body in response to my sarcastic words. His absurd remark unintentionally made me burst into laughter. I had assumed he was simply becoming too busy to get home, but it's more likely that he was spending that time with Scarlett, his partner in the affair. Despite all the concerns, he undoubtedly took his frustrations with me and utilized the money for dates with her on a regular basis. Who exactly is being unfair here? I have been taping everything since earlier, by the way. I pulled my phone out of my breast pocket and began to think back on all the many complaints. Actually, I knew this was going to happen, so I took covert advantage of the opportunity to record my phone in order to get proof. The evidence I've gathered since we got into the automobile goes beyond messaging. This video. I also had concealed cameras in the garage and house, but I kept that a secret from you. And Scarlett, I know everything about you too. They both went white as sheets under my onslaught. I was mad at Freddie, but I also couldn't forgive Scarlett, so I looked into my husband's background in great detail and was able to identify her. She was a 25-year-old recent hire who worked with him in a different area. It appears from reading the mails that she knew I existed, but continued the affair. Therefore, she bears some of the responsibility as well. Oh, sorry, Charlotte. I doubt he anticipated being trapped to this extent. I gazed at them both with all my rage, perfectly feeling contempt for Freddie as he moaned and begged in a voice I had never heard before. "I refuse to pardon either of you. Get ready to pay alimony." My firm comments made them both fall to their knees, maybe comprehending what was about to happen to them. I then got a divorce from Freddie. They had to pay $300,000 in compensation, but it was all because I had videotaped the scene and collected all the evidence. In addition, I was able to get my husband to pay $500 in child support each month. Their bad luck did not stop there. They worked in the same area, which made things unpleasant, and I've heard that their affair caught on with everyone in the company. Eventually, they broke up. Their co-workers disapproved of them both, and ultimately they were left with no option but to step down. It appears that the strain of the compensation payments forced them to end themselves homeless. I'm currently having quiet days with Sophia in the interim. Sophia has a fantastic power, and I will continue to shower her with love so that she might enjoy a happy life in the future. My father-in-law asked as he lay on the sheets, "Are you washing them properly, Kate?" I shuddered to think that this would become a regular occurrence. These kinds of strange incidents might have been commonplace in my life if we had shared a residence. Even thinking about it makes me uncomfortable. My life took a turn for the worst when I got divorced due to unworkable conflicts about living arrangements. I'm Kate, and I went through a divorce when I was 60 years old. But in spite of what others may think about getting older, I think that, even at 60, life is far from finished. Even learning how to operate a computer, a skill that previously seemed beyond my capabilities, is one I've taken on. I'm not going to allow becoming older stop me from taking on new tasks since I'm learning through literature. I'm not attempting to outdo the younger generation in any way. Instead, I still consider myself to be a child at heart. I've faced my fair share of difficulties in life. 10 years after we bought our house, My husband Tom and I had finally paid off our mortgage when the problem started. When we were almost done with the financing, Tom brought up an old subject. We had purchased the house when we were in our late 20s. "How do you feel about cohabiting?" he inquired. "Cohabiting? By that, what do you mean?" "Even though I already knew," I answered. He clarified, "I mean with my parents." We'd had this conversation before, and my feelings remained the same. "Tom, I believe it would be challenging. I do not get along well with your mother. It will only get worse for us both if we move in together. Right now, everything are going well for me. Unless we try, we won't know how it turns out," he urged. "We cannot simply cease living together once we begin. You should never attempt something novel." Even though Tom had been adamantly opposed to living together prior to the wedding, he had been recommending this ever since we were married. At the time, I was relieved. But after we got married, he started to gradually change his attitude, as though he had been playing tricks on me all along. Later on, I discovered that Jane, his mother, had been begging him, saying, "I'm concerned about the future. Do you not think about us as we get older?" Unbeknownst to me, Tom had grown to feel obligated by filial piety to reside with his parents. I hoped he had known that he could say no. "I can see why you would want to look after your parents," but Tom was aware of the conflict between his mother and me. Even still, he didn't seem to be fazed when our relationship grew more tense. His requests to move in together became more frequent and urgent as we approached the last payment on our mortgage. Then the doorbell rang at 7 in the morning on a Sunday. I was surprised to see my mother-in-law, Jane, and father-in-law, Mark, standing there grinning broadly when I answered it. They were surrounded by a light from the early morning sun that nearly gave the picture a hallowed quality. However, I was aware of this. "Welcome back." "Welcome back," greeted Tom, who emerged behind me as I stood there taken aback by their unexpected arrival. I reasoned that typically you say, "Thank you for inviting me," and the host responds, "Welcome." However, I couldn't help but think of Tom's recurring query, "What do you think about living with my parents?" I was no longer able to ignore this, since it was unsettling. What was taking place? Returning to the room with my in-laws, I saw Jane closely examining the antique cabinet. I couldn't contain myself and questioned, "What are you doing?" She said in a worried tone, "Oh, there are quite a few scratches here. It is unfortunate to swap it out for a new one. However, Kate, you appear a little awkward. Please take more care with it going forward. How come?" I had selected the cabinet myself, and I looked closely at the areas Jane was indicating and saw no marks. Maybe her aging eyesight was causing her to mistake the natural wood grain for damage. No, I can't see what she's talking about either, even with my old eyes. However, Jane had previously leveled similar unfounded claims. She seemed to find it intolerable that her beloved son would be taken away by a daughter-in-law. I chose to ignore her comments as usual, even though I thought they were unfair. All of a sudden, I realized that Mark had vanished from view. I heard a commotion from the second floor at that very moment. I became aware of what was happening and felt a wave of dread. To my surprise, as I went upstairs, I discovered Mark face down on my bed. Not Tom's. Not in a way. I gasped in surprise. "Kate, are you doing the sheet washing correctly?" Mark inquired, totally unaware of my fear. "Oh my God, no, 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 no." My voice rising in incredulity, I muttered, "Without a doubt not. Please don't do it to me." I couldn't help but say things more sharply than I had intended. "What is that?" "A daughter-in-law showing such insolence," Mark yelled. "My daughter-in-law has nothing to do with this." Disbelieving, I fired back. "What's the reason behind your bed sniffing?" "I just wanted to make sure it was cleaned properly." "That's unnecessary," I cried out. There is, Mark was adamant. It's a mandatory check for an incoming resident. With my heart racing, I questioned, "What are you talking about?" "Really?" He murmured, "I'm already nervous about having a daughter-in-law who acts so impolite. Cohabiting jointly?" As soon as Mark said those words, the unexpected reality of them struck me, and I felt my entire world tilt. I watched in disbelief as Tom and Jane materialized behind me. Notwithstanding the tension in the room, Tom remarked, "It's noisy here, so this is where everyone is." "Your father is discussing cohabitation," I managed to utter, my voice faltering. Tom questioned nonchalantly, "What's that about?" With a pit in my gut, I questioned, "What do you mean by that?" Tom stated, "This month we paid off the house mortgage, so we've decided to move in with my parents." "How come? You made that decision by yourself?" I cried out, my incredulity giving way to rage. "Have I been inquiring about cohabitation for some time now?" As though this was a plausible justification, Tom said. And I declined. I snapped back, fury in my eyes. I can't live with someone who goes around sniffing people's sheets. "Did you respond to what Mark said with that statement?" With a bewildered look on his face, Tom questioned. I tightly balled my fists, attempting to control my feelings. "Don't worry about it," Jane interjected in a sickeningly beautiful voice. "Your role is over now that the mortgage has been paid off." She flashed a big smile, as though she'd just made an amazing announcement. "What?" Unable to believe what I was hearing, I shot back. "That's correct." Mark threw in a sarcastic remark and waved me off. "You're not required anymore. You are free to leave." A chilly understanding swept over me. Thus, it was as it was. I had been nothing more than a wallet to help pay off the mortgage for years. Jane had been keeping a careful eye on our lives, waiting patiently, and never losing up on her desire to live with us. She thought she could have her cherished son back now that the mortgage was paid off in full, and I could be written off like yesterday's news. Fury bubbled up inside me as the full extent of their manipulation became clear. Certainly, I bore some responsibility for letting things get to this point, but this house was important to me too. There was no reason for me to be subjected to so much distress. But then, in a flash of inspiration, I remembered something, a fact that suddenly wiped away my despair and irritation. "All right then, that's fine," I said calmly, surprising even myself. Tom's eyes widened in shock at my unexpectedly smooth response. He had clearly never imagined that I would agree so easily. Perhaps Tom thought I would beg to stay or reconsider, but I was resolute up until the moment. I left the house. He kept suggesting, "Won't you reconsider?" But I stood my ground. Ultimately, we divorced amicably. A month after the divorce, while I was enjoying the freedom of living in a hotel, having lost my place to live, I received a message from Jane, my former mother-in-law. She insisted on meeting me. Although I found it bothersome, I agreed, slightly hopeful, as I had an inkling of what it might be about. When I arrived at the cafe where we had agreed to meet, I found Jane and the rest of the family, including Tom, sitting with gloomy expressions. As soon as she saw me, Jane's eyes welled up with tears. "Kate, thank you for coming," she said, her voice shaky. "What brings everyone together? Is there something you need from me?" I asked, curious but wary. "Actually, we received the notice of the division of assets from you yesterday," Jane began. "Well, yes, it's only natural to proceed with the division of assets since we're divorced," I replied, maintaining a neutral tone. "Yes, but the situation has changed a bit from before," she continued, looking even more despondent. "How so?" I asked, sensing that something more was at play. My question seemed to dishearten them even further. "Tom's company went under," Jane finally admitted. I clapped my hands together with a smile. I saw that coming. It was only a matter of time. What do you mean by a matter of time? Jane asked, her voice changing with disbelief. In recent years, Tom's salary had been decreasing, and there were signs like delayed payments last month. Those are typical precursors to a company's bankruptcy. How could you not see it? I responded sharply. Jane, who should have had Tom's best interest at heart, asked angrily, "Why didn't you tell us earlier?" Tom flinched in fear, clearly rattled by the conversation. "I never thought it would actually go under," he mumbled. "Normally you'd notice such signs," I retorted, incredulous at their obliviousness. "Eh?" Tom stammered, surprised by my response. I immediately pressed, "So you didn't gather us here just to say that Tom lost his job, did you?" "What's the real reason we're here?" Everyone fell silent momentarily, lost for words. Finally, Tom spoke up. "The truth is, our house burned down. That was caused by my father's smoking. We suffered a huge loss because we decided to live with my parents." Stunned, I took a moment to process the gravity of their situation. I couldn't help but laugh out loud. I had indeed anticipated Tom losing his job when I decided to divorce him. I was unwilling to continue supporting a self-centered, jobless husband. Moreover, if we had lived together, I would have likely struggled with the pensioner lifestyle of my in-laws and possibly the burden of their care. Divorce seemed like the best choice for me. However, I hadn't anticipated Mark burning down the house. This was turning into quite the story to tell. "I'm sorry to hear that, but it really is a tough situation," I said, masking my amusement. "Now that my parents have also lost their home, they have nowhere to live and don't know where to start," Tom explained. "So you've become both homeless and jobless?" I remarked, unable to resist pointing out the irony. "Please stop saying it like that," Tom pleaded. "I'm technically homeless too, since I'm living in a hotel at the moment." I continued, "But I've bought a new house, so I'll be moving out of that status soon." The shock on their faces was priceless. Time to enjoy their reaction. "Do you know the high-rise condominium near the station? I'll be starting my new life there soon." A high-rise condominium? The mention of it instantly changed their expressions. It seemed a high-rise was a symbol of luxury and aspiration for them. My choice to live there wasn't out of desire for prestige, but for a secure and convenient living environment. After the divorce, I wasn't even interested in the view at all. I chose a lower floor to avoid the hassle of waiting for elevators. "We'd like to live there too, Kate. Can you forget about the past and let us live with you?" Jane asked, desperation in her voice. "That would be great, Kate. Please." Though I had half expected it, I couldn't hide my astonishment at their audacity. Asking to live with their recently divorced former daughter-in-law? Could it be that Mark intends to bring calamity even to a high-rise condominium? "I'd like to help, but I'm no longer necessary to you all. Remember, I was just a wallet to you," I said, my words dripping with sarcasm. "Actually, we've always highly valued your skills around the house," they claimed, backtracking quickly. "The house felt brighter with you around, Kate. You're considerate, beautiful, and incomparable to our son. Now that he's unemployed, he's beyond our control." Their son stood silently amidst the groaning, clearly uncomfortable. It seemed that no matter how beloved a son, if he couldn't support them, he was no longer of use to them. What terrible parents. "Well, if we all lived together, it might not be so bad," I said, feeding consideration, prompting shocked expressions from my in-laws and Tom. "It could be more fun than I thought." "What do you mean by that, Kate?" Tom asked, his confusion evident. "I mean it quite literally," I replied, my smile seemingly lifting everyone's spirits. However, facing my ex-husband again felt a bit awkward. "Well, if that's the case," Jane interjected cheerfully, "don't worry about it. Tom doesn't have to live with Kate." Tom looked surprised. What? Why not? Mark added, That's right. Tom should live somewhere else. We'll take advantage of Kate's generosity. Why am I the only one left out? Tom protested. You don't have an income, Mark explained. We have our pensions, so we can contribute to food, but you can't. I really wanted to point out that moving into a high-rise and thinking food expenses would cover everything was naive, but I chose to stay silent and watched as the family conflict unfolded exactly as I had anticipated. Then why don't you, who have a pension, rent another place? I suggested. You've lost your job, and we can't afford such frivolous spending. What if something happens? Mark countered. What are you talking about? We're still young, one of them retorted. Elderly people should, Tom cut him off. How disrespectful. We still have our youth. If you're so young, then work and use that income for the future, I shot back. I can't even take a bath or go to job interviews in this situation, Tom shot back. You can always wash yourself in the river, came the reply. Always thinking about yourself, another added. Huh, you say that as if you do anything yourself, was the sharp comeback. Who's a failure? Tom shot back. We don't need such a useless son anymore. Jane attempted to mediate, asking, Are you really okay with this? But Tom's reaction only seemed to infuriate Mark further, showing no signs of backing down. Turning to me with a smirk, Mark said, This means we'll have more room, right? We're almost excited about starting a new life in the high-rise. Are you misunderstanding something? My cheerful smile seemed to confuse everyone. The size of the room is fixed from the start. I have no intention of living with you. What do you mean, Kate? Jane asked, clearly frustrated. You only mentioned that living with many people might be lively, but you never said we'd actually live together. That was the impression you gave, Jane argued. It's good to see you, who abandoned your husband, living in a high-rise, finally being seen for who you are. You've always looked down on me, and now it's clear you want nothing to do with us. Even after your house burned down, Jane added, her tone sharp. With a stern look in their direction, Tom stated, Kate is correct. I believe that obeying my parents was the proper course of action, but it appears that they are not very concerned about me. Tom's statements left the in-laws astonished, and their emotions changed as they took in the truth of what had happened. With a shaky voice, Tom said, I was wrong. Let's cancel the disarmament. So, Dad, you just want to rely on your son again because you can't live with me, right? I questioned, sarcasm seeping from my voice. No, that's not it at all, he stumbled, blushing. Seeing this, Mark, who had struck the mark, flustered. Tom's forehead was starting to reveal veins of rage. I refuse, he yelled. Parents like you? I answered, disarmament is fine with me. The in-laws begged Tom to listen now that they were in a panic, but he would not hear them. Thanks to you, I really want to start over, he replied, turning to face me. Are you serious? Are you really real? Sickened, I questioned. I mean business. I'm awake now because of what you did, Tom remarked. You still have feelings for me, but stop with that hopeful nonsense, I responded. My only thought was that it would be funny if the man who left his wife for his parents ended up fighting with them after all the cozy family attempts. I've simply considered you to be a tool for dividing up property. Property division? Tom repeated himself. You still plan to claim that from me in this situation? I stated. I couldn't care less. I signed the divorce papers quickly because I wanted to go, of course, but I still have the right to my fair portion of the divided property after the divorce. Be ready. Wait, don't you really love me? Tom pleaded incoherently. How can I love someone who has no place to live or a job? I stated. That's only possible in a fantasy world. Not at all. Unable to win me back, Tom shouted, This can't be happening. Tom became enraged. He became angry and started a ruckus, accusing his parents of being responsible for everything. I left the scene before things got any worse. I got my fair part of the property distribution, just like I promised. Though it wasn't much, it was the last of my friendship with Tom. He was now living a difficult life, struggling with diminished income and becoming distant from his parents. He experimented with day labor and lived a nomadic existence, spending nights in inexpensive hotels or parks. Due to his advanced age, he had trouble finding steady employment, and his parents appeared to have given up on him in favor of their pensions without making an effort to patch things up between them. Tom's parents continued to be a self-centered marriage for years to come. From my end, I was able to live somewhat comfortably because to investments I started before to the divorce. I have started going to a local class to improve my programming abilities. I appreciate the relationship with my classmates, even though the majority of them are kids. It's refreshing. Even though I'm childless, I feel like I've gained a lot of grandchildren. During breaks, a little girl named Livy has been studying from me after expressing interest in me. Soon, more kids started participating, fostering a friendly, lively environment. I'm committed to be true to myself and continue to have a pleasant and rewarding life, despite my varied life experiences.